Hi everyone. This video is just meant to point you to some key moments in Frankenstein that we would have talked about on Monday and today. These may be helpful for you as you're thinking about your reading responses, which if you remembered I moved to be due on Monday, even though if we're able to have class Friday, we will talk about the ending of the novel. So if you can continue reading, that's fine. But if for some reason, because of power outages, you were not able to completely finish the novel, you just need to make sure that you do by the time your reading response is due Monday. So I'm going to point you to three moments. One has to do with sort of sublime setting. One has to do with Justine's trial. And the other one has to do with the monster's story. So if you turn, and this will be most helpful if you have your novel with you. So if you want to pause the video and go get it. If you turn to Volume 2, Chapter 1, the first thing I wanted to point out actually is in the second little tiny paragraph of that chapter, the last sentence in that paragraph says, "Solitude was my only consolation, deep, dark, death-like solitude." And I know we had talked some about how one of the problems that Walton and Victor faced was that they isolated themselves, and so I think we'll see that continue to be a problem for Victor. But if you turn over a page or two into the chapter, maybe 3 or 4 pages actually, you'll get a paragraph that starts, this is when they've decided to go on a little journey through the mountains near Geneva, and the paragraph starts, "The weather was uncommonly fine." And if you look at the descriptions in that paragraph, especially towards the end, "We beheld immense mountains and precipices overhanging us on every side, and heard the sound of the river raging among rocks." And then it just continues on. In the next paragraph, "The valley assumes a more magnificent and astonishing character." And the end of that little paragraph, it says, "It was augmented and rendered sublime by the mighty Alps." And so I wanted you to be aware that a lot of these descriptions are meant to indicate to the reader that this is a sublime setting. And then if you look in chapter 2, we see the effect of the sublime setting on Victor. And of course, the reason why people were interested in landscapes and other things that created a sublime setting was because of how it influenced the viewer, the person in the sublime setting. And this is the second paragraph in chapter 2 of volume 2. It starts, "The following morning the rain poured down in torrents," but I'm looking at the second half of that paragraph. "I remembered the effect that the view of the tremendous and ever-moving glacier had produced upon my mind when I first saw it. It had then filled me with a sublime ecstasy that gave wings to the soul." So there's that transcendent effect of the sublime, right? "And allowed it to soar from the obscure world to light and joy. The sight of the awful and majestic in nature had indeed always the effect of solemnizing my mind and causing me to forget the passing cares of life." Right? So it's kind of raising him above his own personal problems, and he's thinking more big scale, right? And he's realizing he's just a tiny little person in the whole world. And so that's one example where we see the sublime and its effect. In this case, it seems to help Victor. And then the moment following it is the moment where he meets the monster. And we've talked in class about the effect, or the moment, or how we always see the monster in sort of sublime or Gothic settings. I want to go back for a minute and talk about Justine's trial. I think it would be worth you kind of going back and reading through that. And as you do, I want you to think about a few things. This first one is at the end of chapter 6. This is back in volume 1. And I want you to see how Victor and his father are pretty confident in the justice system. And this seems to be kind of partly why Shelley is critiquing that confidence, right? Maybe the justice system isn't all it cracked up to be. So this is near the end of chapter 6, a couple paragraphs from the end. Victor says to his father, "My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent." "If she is," his father says, "God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I hope I sincerely hope that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. And in this assurance, I calmed myself. So here we see, because he knows it was most likely the monster, he's assuming that the creature, then he thinks, well, there's no way she can be convicted based on evidence because it wasn't her. And then kind of the very end of that chapter, he says to Elizabeth, "She is innocent, my Elizabeth, and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." And then his father echoes that, the very last paragraph of this chapter. "If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our judges and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." So here you can see that they think it's no problem. She'll be acquitted, but of course she's not, right? In the middle of the trial, you might notice how people won't speak up for Justine. There's kind of that fear of standing out, right? And maybe being someone who is associated with Justine. So again, kind of leftovers from the French Revolution where people don't want to be seen as not following the crowd or kind of blending in or doing anything to make themselves stand out. Let's see. The paragraph is sort of in the middle of chapter 7 where we see this, and it's a shortish paragraph that says, "Several witnesses were called who had known her for many years, and they spoke well of her, but fear and hatred of the crime of which they supposed her guilty rendered them timorous and unwilling to come forward." So it's sort of interesting to notice how people react in this situation. And then, of course, you might also notice Justine's confession and sort of look at how she felt pressured to do this by the priest. And again, you think about she's alone, separated from the people she loves, accused of this crime, and just kind of track her own sort of confusion and befuddlement and fear. And again, just thinking about the justice system, right, and what Shelley is saying about that. And then the last thing that I wanted you to notice is the effect that it has on Elizabeth. She says, let's see. This is actually the beginning of volume 2 in chapter 1, a couple pages in. And she says, it's in the middle of a paragraph that starts, "When I reflect, my dear cousin, on the miserable death of Justine." Kind of the second half of that paragraph. She says, "Yet she was innocent. I know, I feel she was innocent. Alas, Victor, when falsehood can look so like the truth, who can assure themselves of certain happiness? I feel as if I were walking on the edge of a precipice, towards which thousands are crowding and endeavoring to plunge me into the abyss." So this is pretty striking language. Elizabeth is going through a real crisis of faith, I would say, in this moment. Faith in humanity, faith in the institutions of the Enlightenment, right? Things like the court system, the concept of justice. And so I just didn't want you to pass over that too quickly, that I think Justine's trial can either just seem like a simple plot device or something like that, but I think there's a lot going on in the trial that connects to really key themes in the book, like justice, sort of the ethics of caring for the other, things like that. So then the last thing I wanted to just briefly mention is the monster story. If you're kind of thinking about what are the most important parts of that story, I think anytime you see a response to the monster, that's a moment to look more closely at the story. So there's, real brief responses, like when he first walks into a town and people run from him or throw sticks at him. There's the extended response, right, of the DeLacy family, or that sort of extended story within his story. We see the monster's responses to them secretly, right, as he's watching them. He prepares things for them. And then one of those key moments where he tries to reveal himself to the DeLacy family. Notice how clever he is, right? He waits to reveal himself to old man DeLacy, who's blind and can't see him. And actually that seems to be working until the kids arrive and chase him away. But you should go back and look kind of at the monster's feelings about that. It's a real deep sense of betrayal because he, I think, had begun to feel part of their family. And then I think one of the key turning points that you might go take a look at is after he has run away from the DeLacys. He saves a girl from drowning in the river, but when presumably her father, right, comes running up, he sees the creature kind of grabbing her and I guess assumes the creature is trying to hurt her, and so he shoots the creature. And this is in chapter 8, and I'm just going to turn to it briefly. There's a really great passage where he says, and again, this is right after he gets shot. He says, "The feelings of kindness and gentleness which I had entertained but a few moments before gave place to hellish rage and gnashing of teeth. I vow eternal hatred and vengeance to all mankind." So it was sort of like after this initial betrayal by the DeLacys, which of course was terrible, he still has some innate feelings of kindness because he was going to rescue this girl. But it seems like this moment kind of erases even those feelings. One other moment that I wanted you to notice in his story that's not necessarily connected to responses, other people's responses to him, but is the monster's growing realization of his own sense of self. This is in chapter 4, maybe 2 or 3 pages in. And it's a smallish paragraph that says, "I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions. But how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool." So this is the first time seeing his own self-reflection because he looks into a pool of water. "At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification." So we see this dawning recognition, this self-reflection. So one way you can talk about the monster story is also just his own growing sense of self and realization about who he is. And this is the one other one connected to that is in chapter 5, maybe 3 or 4 pages in. And this is connected to the material that he reads, which is something else important that happens in the story. You can go and sort of look at all the different things that he reads and how it influences him. But the paragraph starts out, "The words induce me to turn towards myself." So great words to indicate this is an inward, reflective moment. And he asks in the middle of that paragraph, "What was I? When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster?" And so it's just this great paragraph, and I just read a couple sentences from it where he's just really grappling with, who am I? What am I? How am I going to discover that? So that desire for self-knowledge. I think those are some other key moments in his story. So again, just 3 moments that I pointed you to. We would have fully explored those in class. We may get to some of them on Friday, depending on what happens, but I wanted to just kind of give you some direction and point you to those moments, the sublime moments that affect Victor, Justine's trial, and sort of some key moments within the monster or the creature story to think about. And you can go explore those more fully, especially if you want to write a reading response on them, because there are 4 different reading response questions, and 3 of them deal with some of those moments that I pointed you to. And on Friday, hopefully we'll be able to talk about the ending of the novel, which we return to Walton, and he gets to meet the creature.